Happy New Year! It's the start of January, which is a time when a lot of us are thinking about New Year's resolutions. And if you're looking for a New Year's themed children's book, there's a good one called Squirrel's New Year's Resolution by Pat Miller that we've read in our house to kickstart conversations about resolutions. But I'm not going to read that one aloud today. Instead, today I'm hoping to spark some inspiration for you to make your own read aloud resolutions for 2022. Reading aloud together is something that my family does a lot of, and it started with my parents when I was a kid, and it's a tradition that we've carried on now that I'm a parent. And I'd like to share today some of the chapter books that my family has read together with my recommendations for how well they work as a family read aloud. And my hope is that you'll leave this video with ideas for books that your own family will enjoy. Maybe today is the day that you set a read aloud resolution of your own for your own family. The first book I want to recommend is called Word of Mouse by James Patterson. This was a great read aloud for my family because it's pretty long. It took a while to get through. We read a chapter a day, but it's not a hard read. It's a really kid-friendly story, adorable characters, a heartwarming plot, and the main character is one that we've really connected to. He's got a lot of personality in the way that he's written. One of the things that I love the most about this book is that at the start of every chapter, there's a quote by the main character, Isaiah, this mouse. And they are adorable little life lesson quotes that were fun for my husband and I to hear and read. But they've also provided some opportunities for us to talk with our kids about what those life lessons mean in their own life. And they're just really cute and funny. So this is one that I highly recommend as a read aloud for your family. And while we're talking about James Patterson, we also read another book of his called Cat versus Dog. This is one that one of my children had previously read, and then we read it together as a family so that my youngest could enjoy it too. This one also has some really engaging illustrations. They have more of a comic book kind of style to it than Word of Mouse. I didn't mention that, but Word of Mouse has really beautiful pencil drawings that are super detailed, really interesting to look at. This one, more of a comic book style. Also really interesting, there's some dialogue that's saved for the illustrations, which was fun for my kids to look at while we were reading. It's a quick read. It's not a super hard one to read. One of the cautions that I will say with this one is depending on the age of your kids, it does get into a little bit of the boy and girl dynamics between the cat and the dog as they start to navigate a friendship that has a small element of romance in it. It's not very noticeable, not very significant, not something that I would have hold me back from reading this with a younger child, but just something that I would maybe note. That the plot of this is a really clever concept of a cat and a dog finding themselves in a situation where they have to befriend each other, they have to lean on each other, and it really deals a lot with the idea of coming together with people that you think you're vastly different from, but maybe have some qualities that are good for you to learn from. So next I want to talk about a couple of the series that we've done. I will say that for family read-alouds, our family loves to find a good series because as soon as we're done with one book, we have something to move on to. It's got the same plot, the same characters. We're already invested in it as a family, and we tend to have the most fun when we're reading a series together. One of the first series that we ever read together, we've actually read through it a couple times, is The Land of Stories by Chris Colfer. You may know Chris Colfer from his role in Glee, but he's a surprisingly good author. I'm not a huge fan of actors turned authors, but this book is really well written. It's a series of 6, and the plot is that these 2 kids fall into a magical storybook, and it's sort of a twisted fairy tale. So they'll meet characters that you know from standard fairy tales, but they learn new and interesting things about those characters. The characters are living through current problems that they have to solve with the help of the children. The children need to find a way to get home. And the series is really captivating and engaging. My husband and I were equally as interested in what was happening to these characters as my children were. They're pretty long reads. The chapters can be long. The books themselves take a while to get through. But it's definitely one of our favorite series we've gone through. I will say that the content can get a little bit darker than young kids will enjoy. There are villains, there are some deaths that happen. The first book starts off reminiscing about the death of the children's father. So if that's a topic that you want to avoid, honestly, you could still read the book and maybe skim through the first chapter or two and edit that as a parent, when you're reading it aloud, kind of summarize those first couple chapters and then get into the more fairy tale heart of the books. The next series that my family tackled was a much lighter read than The Land of Stories. It's The Magic Misfits, and interestingly enough, it's also by an actor turned author, Neil Patrick Harris, and also really surprisingly well written from a writing standpoint. One of the things that we loved about the Magic Misfits books is that Neil Patrick Harris does a great job of introducing vocabulary and explaining things in a kid-friendly way, so that you as a parent don't have to stop and explain what a certain turn of phrase means. He does it within the context of the narration of the story, which was really helpful. There were a number of times when one of my kids would stop us from reading and say, well, wait, what does this mean? And when we read on, the very next sentence was Neil Patrick Harris as the narrator explaining exactly what the answer to that question was, which was helpful from a read aloud standpoint. There are some great adorable illustrations in these books too that kept the kids engaged. These are really quick reads, but they can be more interesting for kids because there are secrets and riddles hidden throughout the pages of the book that kids can spend a longer time on. There are also magic tricks inside the book. Each book has a handful of magic tricks sprinkled throughout the story with how-tos to teach your kids how to do some very simple, basic magic tricks, and that can be really fun. The other thing I love about the Magic Misfits series is the diversity of characters. There are 4 books in the series, and each book focuses on one character's perspective, and each character comes from a unique living situation, a unique background. They each have unique personality struggles that they're working through in the context of the story of that book. And so you get to see these characters wrestle with some things that are really relatable to kids. And the series also does a great job of normalizing different family structures, which I really value and I think is accurate to the world that we live in right now and the experiences of the kids who are reading them. So I found that to be a really valuable addition to our read alouds. The last book series that I want to recommend is a series of Unfortunate Events by Lemony Snicket. And this series has been around for a little while. It is a long series. It has 13 books in the series. Each book is not a hard read, but takes a while to get through if you're doing a chapter a day. There are a couple cautions that I have with this series, but a couple really great positives. Some of the positives are it is hilarious. It's really clever. The writing is amazing. And this author, Lemony Snicket, who is a fictional author and a character within the story himself, he does a lot of what Neil Patrick Harris does in the Magic Misfits, where he'll introduce a concept or an unfamiliar vocabulary word and immediately explain what it means. And that's a theme throughout his writing that I think has been really great for our family to read together and have the kids build their vocabulary. And also it keeps us from having to explain a lot of adult concepts and idioms that the author takes care of explaining for us. The other positives of this story are the plots are absolutely ridiculous. They're funny. We spend a lot of time laughing in this series. The ridiculous things that happen to the kids and the way the kids respond to them provide a lot of really funny conversation for our family as we're reading. We regularly stop reading in the middle of a sentence just to discuss our thoughts about what's happening and what we think is going to happen next, and that's been really fun. A couple cautions that I will give with this one. First is it is a long series. You are committing to 13 books if your kid really likes this story. And some of the early books can be a little bit repetitive. The plot in the early books is very much the same. There are 3 orphans, and they get sent to live with a variety of fumbling or awful caregivers. And overriding that whole story is there's one particular villain who is after their fortune throughout all of the books. And the plot of the first, I'd say 4 or 5, is pretty much the same formula for all of them. But once you get to 6 or 7, it starts to branch out a little bit, starts to change up the plot. We're still not quite sure what's going to happen, but we've been enjoying it. So just a word of caution on the repetitive nature of the first few in the series. The other word of caution I would give about the series of Unfortunate Events books is there's one character who's an associate of the villain who's described as a person who looks neither like a man nor a woman. And the way that that character is handled by the author is not very eloquently done. it can be very offensive in the way that that character is described, even though they are a villain, perhaps especially because they're a villain. They're described in terms that simply just aren't appropriate for our current knowledge of trans issues. And so that's one of the reasons why I recommend a series of unfortunate events more for a family read aloud, where you can censor a little bit, change the wording. There are places where this character is described as it and a beast, and I change those and refer to them as them, or the person instead, because I just think it builds a little bit more of a trans-friendly environment for my kids as they go out and venture into the world, not to have had that exposure of referring to someone in those ways. So the books that I've been describing so far have been relatively current books, but our family has also done some read-alouds of books that I read when I was a child that came from my parents' house bookshelves and are now at our house, and we've read them together as a family. Some of these older books can be really great read-alouds. One that I don't have to show you that we've loved as a family is The Chocolate Touch. That's a hilarious Midas touch sort of book where the young character in it magically ends up turning everything that he touches to chocolate. And at first it's amazing, and then eventually he turns his mother into chocolate and has to navigate figuring out how to solve this colossal problem he's gotten into. Very similar to King Midas. But that's one that we've read and really enjoyed this year. Our family also read The Cricket in Times Square, Bedknobs and Broomsticks. We've read The Witches, Matilda, a lot of Roald Dahl classics. Something that I will caution parents with reading these classics to your kid is some of these books do not age very well. You might be surprised as a parent reading them back how much subtle or even overt racism you'll find, sexism that you will find written into these classic books that we remember from our own childhood. So that's definitely something I will caution parents about. For example, The Cricket in Times Square is one that our family loved. It's a great story, an adorable set of characters, some talking animals, which are always crowd pleasers for kids. The story is just really beautiful, except for any of the chapters that deal with a store owner in Chinatown, which are written in the dialect that this author presumes is a Chinese dialect. It's incredibly offensive to read, and it took a great deal of manipulation on my part as a reader, reading it aloud, to look ahead and change that accent to just standard dialogue, and to remove some of the references that were pretty racist in those select chapters. Now, when this book's not dealing with that particular character, the story is really beautifully written. It's just something to look out for. And one of the reasons why I think reading classics is sometimes better to do as a read aloud, when the parent can be involved and can maybe point out, hey, we just read this part. That's not really the way that people think about the differences between boys and girls now. There are some books, some classic books that refer to gender roles in a way that you can discuss and just clarify with your child that that's sort of an old-fashioned way of viewing things. We've read a number of those classics over the years with the kids. The Cricket in Times Square and The Chocolate Touch were great ones, but also we've done The Enormous Egg, where a boy finds an enormous egg, hatches it, and it happens to be a dinosaur. That's a great one. The boys and their father read Beetles Lightly Toasted, which is a pretty funny book about a kid who experiments with cooking different insects and feeding them to his unsuspecting family and friends as part of a science project that he's doing, and dealing with the consequences from that. I held up earlier Bedknobs and Broomsticks. I will caution this one is very, very, very different from the Disney movie that you might remember. There is specifically a chapter about some cannibals on an island that they encounter that requires a great deal of editing from a parental standpoint in order for it to be culturally appropriate today. There are some really cute classics, so don't shy away from using those. Just maybe give them a little bit of a preview, or read ahead a little bit when you share those with the kids. So those are some really quick recommendations for read-alouds you can try with your family. It's helped our family to have a set time of day that we read together, whether that's before bed or during a meal together. So if you're making your own read aloud resolution this year, finding a time that works for your family is really important. I hope that these recommendations were helpful. If you have any questions about any of these specific books, let me know in the comments and I'm happy to answer them. Happy New Year and happy reading.